So we're just going to jump right on into it. As far as what we're going to cover today, we're going to talk about executive requirements and, when you take one of those C-level roles in your organization, some of the implications behind that, especially from a security perspective. We'll talk about several different frameworks today. So we're going to cover the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, the CIS-CSC, or the CIS Top 20 you may have heard of. We'll talk about balanced scorecards as well as COBIT. So just kind of a quick raise of hands. How many people here, your primary role is security? Okay, a few, and the rest are more generic IT, I would assume. So I think especially for the generalists in the area, the COBIT and balanced scorecards will definitely be of top of interest, shall we say. So cover your assets. So it's all about due diligence, do care, right? So due diligence is to do what a prudent man would do to secure the assets. Do care is to be able to respond, to appropriately respond. So when you have risks, there's different ways that you can respond to it, right? You could mitigate it, you could eradicate it, you could transfer it to insurance. So, or you could do nothing, right? In some instances, the risk might not be significant enough to warrant applying resources to it. So that's always an option as well. So a little bit of my background. So been in the security space a very long time. As you can see, I actually used to have hair when I did this, when I started out. So started my first security consultancy in '94. So before there were any commercial firewalls, actually, I was traveling, lecturing on hardening operating systems, network segmentation, things of that nature. Did pretty well with that company, made the cover of Forbes in '96, sold that company in '02, ran another consultancy, briefly got off the road and became a CISO for an insurance carrier. Learned the pains and stripes of being in your position in operations side and went running back to consulting, and now run the security practice at Nth Generation, which is a 28-year-old solutions provider focused here in Southern California. So pretty heavily certified, so I'm CISSP, CISM, COBIT, and ITIL certified, a previous SANS mentor for the CISSP curriculum. I founded the OWASP chapter, the Open Web Application Security Project chapter here about 13 or 14 years ago, and I'm now erecting our local Cloud Security Alliance chapter. So we actually have, if you're here in San Diego, would love to see you out there. We'll be holding our first event at Amazon on April the 8th, and it'll be on basically governance in the cloud and automation of that governance. So enough about me. As I mentioned, we're going to cover a few different frameworks. We're going to talk about the cybersecurity framework from NIST, the balanced scorecard, CIS, and COBIT. So just kind of curious, COBIT is one that I often don't see a lot of people having familiarity with. A raise of hands, anyone who's used COBIT? Okay, couple, nice. So jumping into the CIS-CSC, so background on this, if you're familiar with SANS, SANS is a phenomenal institute to go learn. They're generally week-long engagements and full immersion training, shall we say. If you're looking for hardcore technical training, definitely recommend SANS. We actually have an event coming up here in San Diego pretty soon. They come here annually. But CIS took that over and rebranded it as the CIS Critical Security Controls. And one thing I wanted to highlight here, and I'll go ahead and read this. This is directly from the California Attorney General just a couple years ago, out of this California breach report. It said, the failure to implement all the controls that apply to an organization's environment constitutes a lack of reasonable security. So what does that tell me as an executive or potentially a lawyer? That tells me that if I don't comply with these and I have a breach, if the law comes in, I could be perceived as potentially grossly negligent as an executive. And the result of that, as we've seen in like Target and several other instances, is you get to be a defendant along with the corporation in that engagement. So remember, if you have a security-based title and you're a senior, you're a C-level person, make sure that you're doing your appropriate CYA, because you could very likely become a defendant if you're in a breach situation. And feel free to ask questions along the way. I forgot to mention that. So if you're not familiar with the CIS, there's basically three major categories. There's the basic top six, the foundational, and the organizational. And so it's kind of interesting. They have classified this as the way they perceive it as the most important to the least important or less important, but I kind of question that. So for example, penetration testing and red team exercises, that's pretty important, right? There's another one, where is it? Vulnerability, yeah, so this one I am glad they got the vulnerability and patch management in the early stages, but incident response is another one that I always highlight. So we do a lot of what we call virtual chief information security officer work, where myself or one of my teammates will go in and act as basically a CISO for an organization. And I can tell you that incident response is generally a weak area, and due to the volume of breaches, it should definitely be a strong area, hopefully, for your organization. So in my opinion, I think that should have been kicked up, but it is what it is. So you can see it, it's top 20, but there are several other facets below these. So while there's only 7 major tenets here, you'll see later the exact number of facets that we're looking at with these. So with NIST, I did want to mention one thing on these, both of these. So you can notice with the CIS controls that all these things are kind of related to risk management. It doesn't really talk anything about value delivery. It doesn't really talk anything about quality of IT. It doesn't really talk about quality of service delivery or anything. It's really focused on risk management. You'll see the same thing here with NIST. So just if you're not familiar with NIST, again, it's the National Institute of Standards of Technology, very well-known organization. They do the majority of the detailed security work for the government. A lot of what comes out of that becomes public. You guys may be familiar with like NIST 800.53 is probably one of the most well-known articles that they have published, but very well broadcasted, and since it comes from the government, it's generally well adopted internationally. So if you look at what this framework focuses on, it's again very much focused on risk mitigation. You can see even the major tenets here, you know, as far as identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. Those are basically the same type of methods that you use to deal with an incident, right? So if you look at all of these, none of them relate to value delivery or anything. It's strictly risk management. So in both of these frameworks, if you're focused on security, that's fantastic. If you're looking at a broader context around how well is IT delivering to the business, then some of the other frameworks that we'll talk about may be better suited for you. So wanted to kind of compare and contrast. Usually organizations will pick up one of these as opposed to both. So NIST, as I mentioned, more internationally recognized. So the CIS is more like just a nonprofit organization, doesn't carry the same amount of weight as NIST. The other thing is the public mappings are huge. So anytime we go in and, for example, we start either a strategic engagement with a customer or a vCISO engagement, we're always looking to benchmark existing posture. So with NIST, there's widely available mappings to many different frameworks. So if you're highly regulated, so if you have like SOX and PCI and HIPAA and OCC and FRB and OTS and all these, you know, the laundry list of regulatory bodies that you're needing to comply with, then NIST is really good because of the mappings. What it allows us to do is we'll go ahead and follow NIST, but then when your PCI auditor comes in, we can basically pivot those controls to PCI regulations, and now we can put our policies, procedures, directives directly in correlation with the order of which like the PCI auditor would want to see, hopefully mitigating their time in our location and getting them off-site as fast as possible, right? The other thing is, you can see on this previous slide, a lot of focus around recovery and respond. So NIST has a big interest in that incident response, whereas you could kind of see CIS had put incident response kind of lower on the totem pole. So that's one of the other significant differences. As far as the mapping numbers, you can see not too far off. 108 controls for the CIS or the CSC, the CSF, the Cybersecurity Framework, and 171 for the CIS-CSC. So not much more. If you're familiar with doing SOX auditing or anything like that, I've seen many organizations have 300, 400, 500 controls. So having sub 200 is relatively digestible, right? So you can see here, COBIT definitely has a different spin. So the control objectives for IT. So the interest here is risk management as well as value delivery. So you can see how this more aligns with like the CIO or the CTO's initiative. Very often, security isn't even in IT. It's often in compliance or reports directly to the board or to the CEO or to the audit organization. Because sometimes if security's stuck inside of IT, it usually doesn't have its unique budget. And thus, it's like, do we buy more storage or do we buy some security stuff, right? And there's a conflict of interest there a little bit. So, you want to have that separation of duties. So we see that a lot in hierarchical employee diagrams and things of that nature. So, audit and assurance, risk management, information security, regulatory compliance, and as I said, governance is a significant portion here. So I thought I'll go ahead and read this one as well. So fundamentally, enterprise governance and information technology is concerned with value delivery of digital transformation and the mitigation of business risks that results from that digital transformation. So we're hearing about transformation all over the place these days, right? We're seeing massive uptick in artificial intelligence, machine learning, distributed compute, right? Now we're seeing, a huge adoption into multi-cloud environments, disaster recovery in the cloud. We're seeing a lot of transformation, right? I mean, barely anyone uses tapes anymore, right? So along with that, we have to be continually focused on service delivery as well. So, the way we used to deliver IT in the early 90s is certainly not the way we're serving it up today, right? So this is kind of an overview of what COBIT looks like. So you can see at the very top, benefits realization, risk optimization, and resource optimization. So you can see primary tenets are around value creation, effectively leveraging the resources, and providing quality to the business as opposed to strictly risk management or governance. And I won't walk through this entire slide, but you can see how it bubbles up this, and then the breakout down below of how these roles and responsibilities get erected. So, jumping on to the balanced scorecard. So, anyone here familiar with balanced scorecard strategy maps? Awesome. Got one in the room, so I like sharing interesting ideas. So balanced scorecard came out, I believe, like 74 or 76. Norton and Kaplan created it. It originally what came out of the Harvard Business Review. It did so well that they ended up writing 3 different books. The balanced scorecard was the first one to come out, and that's the one we're going to talk about today. Strategy maps kind of takes those scorecards and describes how to turn them into action. So it's great to know your strategy and where you want to go, but it's a whole other thing trying to create the momentum and resource provocative interest for the resources to actually do what you're wanting to provide in that strategy. And then the execution premium is just more around quality of those deliveries. So the concept around balanced scorecard, there's one of the big takeaways is paradigms. So there's 4 different paradigms. And so if you've ever read 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, you've probably heard this little story, but in case you don't know what a paradigm is, so guy gets onto a subway with a couple young children, right? They're riding down the subway. The kids are just causing complete chaos on the subway. You can tell it's frustrating a lot of other people that are traveling. So a guy sitting next to the father, kind of nudges him, and he's like, hey, your kids are causing a pretty significant disruption. Could you, do something, right? He's kind of frustrated at this point, right? He just got off of work or whatnot. And the guy looks up and he's like, oh man, I'm so sorry. We just left the hospital. We found out their mother has terminal cancer, right? So when you saw the guy not responding to his children, you were probably pretty frustrated with him and wanting to kick him off the train. By the time you heard about the cancer story, you were probably wondering how you could assist him and maybe make his life better, right? It's all a matter of the paradigm. So similar to this graphic to the right here, it's like, is there 3 or 4 there, right? It's all a matter of your perception, the way that you're perceiving it. So in the balanced scorecard, there's 4 paradigms we're going to talk about. So from a customer perspective, from a financial perspective, from an internal process perspective, and finally learning and growth. So what do I mean by that? So from a financial perspective, when we're looking at building out strategic initiatives around this, I'm thinking of, so if I were to put myself, for example, in the CFO's chair or the board's chair for a public organization, what would they be wanting to see my department executing on? So just to back up briefly, scorecards can be used by many different entities. They can be used by the organization as an enterprise as a whole. It could be used as your business unit, like the IT as a whole, or it could even be down into the individual divisions, like maybe networking may have their balanced scorecard and servers may have their scorecard. So in that context, from a financial perspective, what is it that my department is providing to the business, and how do I create financial value for the organization? And based on that, that's how I'm going to start coming up with the metrics that I'm a trend on. From a customer perspective, so for example, I'm a consultant, so I really have 2 sets of customers. I have the salespeople that I work with, because obviously I'm directly engaged with them. I'm providing the technical competency behind what we're bringing to customers. And then obviously I have my end users as well, right? I do deliver consulting reports, not to the salespeople, but obviously our customers. Learning and growth, so that's really important, right? You're either growing or you're shrinking. You're generally not staying stagnant. So finding quality talent and retaining it, learning and growth is extremely important. I'm sure you guys have seen, especially in the security field, it's hard to retain high-level quality talent. Not only is it hard to retain it, but it's hard to find it as well, and it's generally not cheap. I can tell you, that's one of the reasons why our vCISO stuff does so well, is because, very often we'll see ticket prices of anywhere from $250 to $275 for a full-time CISO. Most organizations aren't interested in mitigating risk to that extent. Often if you're not securing silo codes for nukes, then you don't necessarily need to have the same level of security, right? And so because of that resource initiative, we're seeing a lot around that. And then the internal business processes, this is really around optimizing the delivery. So optimizing our swim lanes, understanding the services that we're delivering, and trying to hit on all cylinders. It's really focused on quality and optimization. So that being said, this is kind of what you'll often see as far as the way people roll these out. So you'll have objectives, measures, targets, and initiatives. So, and you'll build those in each one of these 4 paradigms. So what does that kind of come out looking like? It ends up looking like you'll have basically 4 tiers. You'll have metrics in each of those tiers, and then you trend on them. So that being said, I can tell you often what happens when I go in, for example, doing the CISO work. I'll come in and I want to understand existing posture. So I'll ask the IT executive that I'm working with, help me understand existing posture. What kind of measures do we have? A huge proponent of managing by measure it. If you can't measure it, you can't manage it, to be frank. So what ends up usually happening is the IT executive goes out to the people that report to him, networking, storage, server, or whatever, and he asks them to go gather information about what they're doing. And what usually ends up coming back is a large amount of noise and not a lot of signal. They end up going out to whatever solutions they have, finding the coolest looking graphics that they can find, putting that into a Word document or a PowerPoint presentation and delivering them back to us. The result of that, from my perspective, is a clear description or validation that the IT people do not understand how they're strategically aligned to the business, and they don't necessarily know what they should be focused on, right? You often hear about analysis or paralysis by analysis, right? That you can generate measures on tons of different types of things, but a lot of those things aren't necessarily important. So that being said, we'll talk a little bit about how to put those performance measures together and what those should be including. But as you're building out the scorecard, a couple kind of gotchas. So with all of these frameworks, I'll give you a little suggestion. So I'll give you a story to go behind it. So when I was at the insurance company, I had been, consulting now for probably 15, 18 years, something like that. When I come in and I do a vulnerability assessment and penetration test, and I do a debrief, usually people are listening when I talk, right? I'm an independent third party, highly paid person that you asked for my opinion. And so when I give those recommendations, they generally heed them. I generally see most organizations actually respond to those recommendations. Well, at the insurance company, I went and started at the insurance company, and so needless to say, I wanted to know existing posture, so I conducted a vulnerability assessment, penetration test, risk assessment, and I found a lot of areas for opportunities for improvement. So I shared that with the executive team, and I basically got blown off. I found that having that independent third party was extremely important. So the reason I mention that is one thing that I also had happen there was I was really endorsing COBIT at the organization. So while I was leading risk management, I was on the executive management team for IT. So being ITIL focused on service delivery and things of that nature, I was pushing COBIT. And over my tenure while I was there, we had 3 different CIOs in like a 2.5 or 3 year period. And one of them came in as a chief transformation officer. And she was a lady from another large consultancy that was solely focused in insurance. They do some good work, the Tower Group. So she came in and she sat me down, and her very first thing that she told me, she's like, I don't like COBIT at all. She's like, I hate it. And I'm just like, and she knew obviously I was endorsing it at the executive levels, and so, my response was, okay, that's fine. As long as we can, leverage logical frameworks and everything, then, I don't really have issue with that. The reason I say that is, if you're going to take some of these techniques back to your organization, be cautious of whether you want to tell them that you're using one of these certain types of frameworks or not. So the tenets behind any of these things are best practice, right? And you'll see them overlapping. But often people have tried to leverage different types of frameworks and may not have had as positive a outcome as they would have liked or had been planning on. So be cautious if you're going to leverage any of these things, as far as whether you actually want to just take the concepts of it and apply them, or whether you actually want to try to get endorsement for picking up one of these frameworks. But so that being said, when we're talking about building out these metrics, the things that are important, keeping first things first, starting with strategy, not metrics, is really key. So one of the things I like to do whenever I'm doing innovative stuff, I intentionally do not sit next to a computer. I either grab sticky notes or a whiteboard or a piece of paper or something, because when I'm in front of a computer, I always feel like I got to be typing something. I got to be constructive. I can't just sit there in front of the computer. So it's good to often do like whiteboarding sessions and things of that nature, but think about strategy and not quality, or not incremental improvement as well. So incremental improvement, you could use the measures in the operational paradigm and focus on quality, but across the board with your KPIs, be focused more on strategy and innovation, things that can help the organization grow as opposed to just optimize, right? Optimizing may increase your revenue by reducing the amount of resources required to execute something, but it doesn't actually create additional value. And so even back in like about 96, 98 timeframe, I wrote an article for a magazine about making risk a strategic value. So if you think about back in the day when the internet was just, flourishing and just starting out, people were still dialing up on AOL and everything, and people were really concerned about security, right? For a very long time, you never saw bank transactions or anything like that, anything, processing credit cards or any of the like on the internet. It was just too risky. And then we ended up seeing Wells Fargo be the first one to come to the market and actually have a web-based online banking solution, and that was huge. I don't know if you guys remember, but they marketed the crap out of that, and they got a lot of brand endorsement for that. And why did they get that additional money? Why did they get all that additional value and brand recognition? It was because they were able to leverage risk management better than their peers. They were able to mitigate the risk to an acceptable level for the business faster than their competitors, right? So there's a lot to be said there. Do not cascade the scorecards. So if you're going to use scorecards, balanced scorecards throughout the organization, whatever the executives are using for their scorecard, it may be of interest to you to at least understand the expectations of the business and strategically where the business is planning on going. But do not use that as direct, kind of waterfall methods into your performance indicators. While it's of interesting context, it's more important for your business unit, whatever that unit is that you're working with, to come up with your own most important strategies and innovations, because often you'll have innovations the business certainly will not know about, and conversely, we often find other business units have initiatives that IT never knows about, right? So cascading the scorecards kind of hinders innovation, and that's the reason why organizations say it's generally not recommended. I'm gonna try to remember the name of a book that I just recently picked up. I just came back I took a class at Harvard on the consulting toolkit, and I found a really good book on, it's called Beyond Performance. So if you're interested in different types of strategies, methods, tactics to accomplish quality, risk management, things of that nature, Beyond Performance, highly recommend that book. It's got 40 different tactics inside of it. So as I mentioned, strategy is more about innovation, not optimization. So again, think about ways that you can create new avenues of revenue, new service offerings to the business units, things of that nature, as opposed to just optimizing, because you can only do so much with optimization, right? We've kind of all seen that. If you've ever been around Six Sigma at all, you've probably felt the pains and strifes of just focusing on optimization. And then using the scorecard to empower teams. So, there's often good delegators, let me go backwards. Bad delegators do basically gopher mentality, right? Go for this, go for that, very, what would you call it? Kind of micromanaging, for lack of a better word. That's not a very good example of a quality manager. A manager should be able to give someone a task and let them complete it, let them come up with their own methods in order to get there, and then the manager should be mentoring them and basically mitigating roadblocks to their success, right? If I'm just telling you go for this, go for that, my ability to manage large groups or large numbers of projects dramatically dwindles, right? You can only manage so many things, and if I'm micromanaging, I'm not going to be able to achieve large goals, especially not many of them. So what's good about empowering the teams is because we come together as a group, because we come up with these measures together, we're all marching to the same goal, right? There's many reasons there's many values to that, I should say. One is, there was an interesting article not too long ago that was published about how to motivate people. And this was in the Harvard Business Review. And they, in summary, they found that generally blue-collar workers, the more money you gave them, the harder they would work. With white-collar workers, they found that once they kind of had a comfortable salary or comfortable financial situation, giving them more money didn't necessarily translate to direct additional output from those individuals. They ended up finding the two things that had white collars excelling and motivated about their organization and wanting to stay. One was work-life balance, right? We see that more and more these days with the focus around people wanting to be able to work from home, have more dynamic work schedules, things of that nature. The other thing was the ability to impact the organization. If a resource is out there and they're trying to do good stuff and they're not having any type of realization or gratitude for their hard work, after a while, you're not going to want to work that hard, right? If you have interesting ideas, you want to be heard, you want to have influence, you want to be able to share and grow grow as a group. And if you don't have that, then that's definitely frustration for a lot of people. So, having these measures up front so that all team members can go back to these measures on a consistent basis and understand how they're directly impacting the quality of what they're delivering and how their individual projects are achieving larger strategic goals for the organization is huge. Just a quick time check here. All right. So as far as key performance indicators, so a couple things I wanted to mention here. So one is you want kind of a blend of leading and lagging indicators. And so what I mean by that is I don't know if I mentioned or not, but my title at Nth is Director of Security and Analytics. So I do a lot with big data and things of that nature as well. So leading in, we want to be able to forecast what's going to happen in the future, but we also want to see what happened in the past to see if we were effective, if there was, some type of continuous improvement or things of that nature that we should be executing on. And so I gave a couple examples here. So like a trajectory of attacks against the online website would be leading, right? I'm trending what's happening, I'm continuing to watch it, and now I'm maybe forecasting. Is it going to continue to go up? Am I going to see a dip? So on and so forth, right? A lagging indicator would be like looking at historicals. So, what have I done with a certain industry over the last 5 years? Or what's my attrition of my customer base over the last 10 years or things of that nature. So definitely a lot of value to both of those, but it's generally recommended to have a blend of both. So, it's great to know what happened in the past. If you can be predictive, though, that's really interesting, because if I can be predictive, that may help with my innovation inside of whatever it is I'm working on. They generally say limit to no more than 3 to 5 per paradigm. So remember, financial, customer, learning, operations. Generally no more than 3 to 5. The reason they say that is because if you get too many measures, it almost kind of waters down what's most important. So they generally recommend a limited number of measures. Using SMART metrics, right? So specific, very specific, know what you're measuring, make it measurable, attainable, realistic, and time-driven, right? So if I had a key performance measure that it took me 6 months to get the result of that value and I needed to trend that on monthly basis, that's not a functional measure, right? So we want to make sure that our measures can trend and are efficient. So definitely recommend SMART types of measures. Keep testing your APIs or KPIs. So, when you initially go to the table or, your whiteboard or your sticky board or whatever you're using to create your KPIs, you're going to have some really interesting dialogue. I foster a lot of these meetings, and I think the recipients get a lot of value out of it. They learn a lot from their peers that they may not have known earlier. And so when you first sit down and start trying to create these KPIs, you may come up with a bunch of ones that you perceive are, sexy and functional, but, as you begin trending them and watching them on a scorecard over a period of time, you may find that there's other ones that maybe would be more impactful, or there's new types of things that we need to trend. So don't perceive that once you create your scorecard, you're locked into it. It's much like your business continuity programs, or your incident response programs, or your risk management programs, or your vulnerability and patch management programs. These are continual cyclical things, right? You don't stand it up and then it's all good for eternity, right? You need to keep on monitoring, measuring, and refining. And then sharing the KPI performance widely. So especially when it comes to security, often people have difficulty communicating to non-technical executives what all that investment in the security countermeasures has done for the organization. So back to the insurance company, when I came in, they had no security group, so I erected the Security and Risk Management Organization. And so I was given a pretty substantial budget, and I'm executing it, so on and so forth. And, the board starts wondering, and so does my CIO. He's like, so, you spent all these millions of dollars on countermeasures. We had never had a breach before you came here. We've spent all this money, and we still haven't had a breach. How can you justify or demonstrate the value out of all this investment, right? We haven't seen any additional or reduced risk. And so using a scorecard is a great way to do that. And so again, the first thing that would come to mind for lots of people is like, oh, well, let me tell the CIO how many pieces of malware we blocked this month, and how many things were stopped at the firewall and things of that nature. Well, from an IT person's perspective, that might be interesting. You might actually get cool graphics coming out of your countermeasures, but the executive, on the other hand, could probably care less, right? They're more interested in how well, so for example, if we've picked up a framework, are we trending towards compliance? What kind of progress have we made there? Are we able to get the auditors in and out faster? Because obviously that's going to reduce our costs, both from an audit perspective as well as from our side of leveraging resources. Those are the things that may be more interesting to an executive. So having those measures and available up front, and being cognizant of the broad communication of those metrics is very useful, so that then when you go to the board, you have measures that make sense. And so definitely recommend that. So to wrap up, just wanted to give you kind of a brief background on some of the things that we do. So one of my favorites is what we call red team testing. You may have heard of this. And so red team is basically, you give us a critical asset and you give us a time window, and it's basically, as long as it's no safety or health issues or no destruction of assets, anything goes. So I'll give you a quick story. So like, I did one at a casino. They wanted to see how close we could get to the vault in the basement. And so ended up walking through the casino, got, snapped a shot of someone's badge, ended up going down to Kinko's and replicating one for myself. And all of a sudden I was the internal auditor for this casino right away. And so, yeah, ended up really interesting. So like, we had the refrigerators in our room where like it's stocked, and when you take something out of it, it automatically bills. So we're like, oh, that's obviously got to be on the network, right? So rip apart the refrigerator, we're jacking in through all the debugging stuff through the fridge and everything, and yeah, ended up, long story short, ended up down loitering down near the vault for a good 20-30 minutes. I snapped a photo of it and I sent a picture to the VP of Public Safety, the guy that runs all the guards. I was like, is this the vault? And he just responded after a few minutes. He said no, and it was pretty weird. It's got an intercom outside, full shielded door, all solid metal and everything, no other door in the basement like it. So I responded to him. I was like, well, then what is it? And he's like, oh, well, it's the man trap. And so if you're familiar with man traps, basically what they are is you have 2 sets of doors and only one door can open at a time. So you have to have multiple people in order to execute any type of breach, right? So then I needless to say, responded, I was like, well, what's behind the man trap? And he's like, oh, the vault. So it was pretty crazy. But yeah, so there's no ability for us to engage with the local police departments or anything. So if they come in, they're hot. So these things are very fun, very high adrenaline. I usually can't sleep for 24 hours afterwards, but they are my very favorite. So if you're interested, I'm sure I can get you discounts. I don't know if I mentioned, but at our booth over here, I have a bunch of locks. So I'm just about to become a licensed locksmith here in the state of California as well. So if you ever have been interested on picking locks and other ways that we breach electromagnetic doors and stuff, come check out the booth. But yeah, a lot of vulnerability assessments, penetration tests, social engineering. If you attended the IBM session earlier today, you probably heard about the large amount of the attacks being originated against basically your employees. So, you know, back in the day, back in the early 90s, we used to attack the perimeter. You know, lots of people weren't doing a very good job at vulnerability and patch management on the perimeter. Most people have hardened up those borders pretty tightly. It's patching stupid that's the problem. And so people are definitely your weakest link. And so a lot of activity around social engineering, both on-site and remote. Security roadmaps as well. And 2 complementary things I wanted to leave you with. So these are services that we offer to prospects and customers. One is the unstructured data risk assessment. So right outside this door actually is Varonis. If you're not familiar with them, they do basically unstructured data analysis. So they'll go out and look at your email and your SIFs and your SharePoint and whatnot and find all those work products that have sensitive data that you generally don't have visibility into. So you think about, you know, traditionally our critical assets, you know, your ERP, for example, you probably know the rows and columns inside that database that has sensitive information. You probably don't know what's being shared through email and Excel files and Word documents and things of that nature. You probably don't have the same amount of understanding around that. Varonis provides that functionality, and basically we can come in and do a 30-day eval. We drop it in, we evaluate the environment, can tell you where there's excessive privilege as well as do the data classifications. So another really interesting use case for that is if you're migrating stuff out to the cloud, you don't want to just take trash and move it out to the cloud because it costs money, right? So sanitizing that, getting rid of all that sludge, shall we say, is another good benefit. Or M&As, if you're in M&A activities, there's really a lot of value there. And then secondly, as I mentioned through the presentation, we leverage either the NIST CSF or the CIS-CSC when we're engaging with customers, and we offer a complimentary gap assessment with that. So basically, I or one of my peers would come in, you get to lay down on the couch for a couple hours, we'll have a very frank conversation about the existing security posture, and then we come back with generally a multi-year roadmap that describes in a prioritized fashion our recommendations for remediation based on findings. So with that, I was given a 10-minute thing about just a couple minutes ago, so we probably have just a couple minutes. I wanted to open it up to see if anyone had questions for me. Oh, did I do that good of a job, guys? If I don't have any questions, that's all I have for you today. Oh, I did actually have a few more. I forgot I threw this in last thing, so I wanted to give you some recommendations as far as walkaways. Whenever I come to presentations or engagements, I like to have something that I can take back and execute on. So attaining senior management buy-in is critical. If you're trying to drive security from the bottom up, go find another job. Picking a suitable framework, find one that works for you and leverage it. Remember that when you pick up a framework, you don't have to use necessarily everything inside of it. Pick up the things that are appropriate for you and leverage them. Focusing on strategy first. Again, don't be focusing on just optimization. Think about building and growing as opposed to just optimizing. Using those smart KPIs, and then finally, never stop inventing. Keep going back to the wheel. Keep pushing the envelope. Listening to the people in your group, because they may have a lot of interesting things to share that, unless you kind of solicit it out of them, you wouldn't get otherwise. Thank you.